Chapter 2, 1842. A child no longer. Adele was frightened and angry. We can't, my darling. Your papa and I would never stop you from following God's call. But how are we to know if this is God's call? The good sisters of Providence who taught you, they follow God's call. Why could you not join them? But to go to the other end of France among strangers, and to go to the ends of the earth among savages and cannibals? That is rash, foolish. God does not ask foolishness. He asks us to serve Him wisely and well. And what if things are not what they seem? Added Louis. What if you should be stranded in foreign parts? What if you were ill or unhappy or lost among evil people? How would we know? How could we bring you safely home again? Euphrasie argued and wept. Louis and Adele were adamant. No daughter of theirs was going off on such a crazy scheme. To allow it would be sinful negligence on their part. The family was in turmoil. It was Father Le Fournier who came to the rescue. I have investigated further, he said, and I have satisfied myself that these people are sound and reliable. He reassured the distressed parents. If anything goes wrong, I myself will be responsible to see that Euphrasie comes home safely. Just let her try her vocation, he urged. Put your trust in the good God that He will lead her. After hours of argument and days of consideration, Louis and Adele finally agreed reluctantly. If God really wanted this, they could not refuse, but their hearts were broken. Euphrasie was in misery, torn with guilt and grief. Never before had she been so completely at odds with Mamma. Mamma, who had been her conscience from her babyhood, and was still arbiter of all right and wrong in the Barbier household. Only once before had Euphrasie and Adele quarrelled seriously on the adult level, and that dispute had soon ended happily. That had been only a few months ago, and the quarrel had been about a hat. Such a trivial thing it seemed now, though it had not been so at the time. For a long time, Euphrasie had been begging her mother to get herself a new bonnet, a fashionable bonnet, such as women of her age and state wore, but Adele had refused even to consider the matter. She was content to wear the traditional headdress of the Con region, a tall construction of lace framing the head and shoulders, supported by wings called butterflies, beautifully crafted, but now quite old-fashioned and scorned by women of taste. One day, stung by an overheard remark about grannies and their butterflies, Euphrasie decided to take matters into her own hands. Millinery was a familiar hobby with many young ladies of her acquaintance, and Euphrasie's skills were better than most. Buying a shell, a stiffened frame, from the local milliner, Euphrasie worked secretly on a modern bonnet for her mother, fashionable, tasteful, and in a quiet colour, toning beautifully with Adele's Sunday dress. Pleading and argument would never get it onto Adele's head, Euphrasie knew, so she had to take desperate measures. Smuggling the lace headdress out of Adele's wardrobe, Euphrasie had carefully taken it apart, saving the good lace for some future use, and throwing the butterflies into the kitchen fire when no one was around to see. On Sunday morning, there had been such a scene as the family had never experienced before. Mama had not acquiesced reluctantly and then laughed off the situation as Euphrasie had expected. She had been furiously angry, almost tearful with distress. Finally, flushed and trembling, she had allowed the foreign bonnet to be put on her head only in desperation, as it was time for Mass, and she could not go to church with her head uncovered. Painfully self-conscious and angry that this ordeal had been inflicted on her at a time and place she held sacred, Adele had hurried home again afterwards before any neighbour's comments could add to her embarrassment. For the rest of that miserable day, mother and daughter had avoided each other. Never before had Euphrasie felt such guilt and grief, and anger too. Why did Mama have to be so absurdly stubborn and old-fashioned? A great lump of remorse seemed to have settled heavily inside Euphrasie's bruised heart. It was small comfort that on the next Sunday, Adele had donned the bonnet of her own accord, and her eyes had met Euphrasie's with a smile. No further comment was made about the bonnet, and it became an accepted part of Adele's life. Mama was no longer open to thoughtless ridicule. Euphrasie had won a victory there, but the price had been more than she would ever risk again. Now it felt like the worst of that quarrel all over again, but this time it seemed that the guilt and grief could never come to an end. It was days before anyone could speak again of the painful topic of her vocation. But one evening Louis asked, "When are you leaving us?" "At the beginning of October, Papa," Euphrasie answered. "So soon!" cried Adele. She was silent for a moment, and then stood up abruptly. "We must get ready then," she added. "What do you need to take with you?" Euphrasie was suddenly aware of her mother's goodness and generosity. "I have a list, Mama," she said gently, "but you must not worry. It will not be a burden to you. You know I have always saved from my earnings, and I can pay my own way." That was true. For a long time now, Euphrasie had been supporting herself and also regularly paying board to her mother. The weeks went quickly while Euphrasie gathered her trousseau and the necessary papers. At last came the day of departure. Adele insisted that they all have an early dinner together. She had prepared a particularly nice meal for this evening, but they ate with little enjoyment. Euphrasie went to her room for the last time to put on her cloak and bonnet. She hugged and kissed each of the family. "Be good to Mama and Papa. Take care of them," she whispered to Naomi and young Louis. She picked up little Mari and hugged her close. She laid her face against Adele's wet cheek. "I will pray for you, Mama. I will always pray for you," she murmured. There was so much Adele wanted to say. Before she could get the words out, Louis had picked up Euphrasie's corded box. "Come, come, everyone, to the coach stop, to the coach stop," he urged gruffly, and the whole family hurried after him. Their short wait was silent and awkward. Near 6 o'clock they heard the clattering of hooves and the rumble of wheels. They turned to watch the coach round the corner and roll up the street. It stopped in front of the Barbier family. While the horses stood stamping and snorting, the coachman loaded Euphrasie's box. With a last quick hug for each one, Euphrasie turned away quickly and mounted the steps of the coach. With their eyes streaming, Adele and Louis waited for her to seat herself and turn again to the window for a last word. Her cheeks were very pink and her eyes very bright. Her lips were trembling as she lifted her hand to wave. Young Louis stepped close to touch the coach and stretched as tall as his 9 years would let him. "Euphrasie," he called up through the window, "when are you coming back?" Euphrasie tried to swallow the great lump in her throat. "Soon," she said huskily, and not another word would come. With a jerk and a clatter, the coach began to roll over the cobblestones. The family stood waving until it turned the corner and disappeared behind a brick wall. Inside the coach, Euphrasie lowered her hand and fumbled hastily for her handkerchief. Before she had it out, the tears were streaming down her face. Hiding behind her big bonnet, she wept bitterly. The other passengers seemed not to notice. It was getting dark outside, and they were already settling down for the night. When Euphrasie finally put away her wet handkerchief and looked timidly around, they were tucked into their rugs and greatcoats, and leaning back with their eyes closed. Euphrasie tucked her cloak snugly around her and leaned back into her corner. She was exhausted, but she could not sleep. Through the window she watched the blacker shapes of trees and buildings in the darkness, and sometimes specks or clusters of lights as the coach rolled on past houses and villages. When one of the passengers muttered about cold air and pulled the thick curtain right across the small window, the inside of the coach became a dark box, bouncing and rocking, with its wheels rumbling on the stones beneath. Euphrasie resettled herself into the corner of her seat. Her eyes were swollen and her head ached. Her heart was aching unbearably too, but there were no tears left. She thought of her family around the fire at home. She could see their faces and hear their voices. Right now they would be preparing for the night. She could see them finding their places to kneel for night prayers. Little Marie snuggled up to Papa, and young Louis trying to share Mama's beads. Or is it different tonight, she thought. Is someone kneeling in my place? Have they all moved? She decided to say her night prayers with them, but her prayers began to get jumbled. She started again. She found herself reliving the past few weeks at home. Trying to concentrate, she started her night prayers again, and then again in the darkness while the coach rumbled on. She saw her parents and the children clearly, but something seemed to be wrong. There was something she desperately wanted to tell them, but a great noisy barrier had risen between them, and she could not get their attention, no matter how hard she tried. Suddenly she was jolted awake. For a moment she thought she was dreaming, and then she remembered. I must have been fast asleep, she thought. Whatever is happening now? She realized that the coach had stopped. The other passengers were beginning to clamber past her and out the door. She sat forward to look out. It was quite dark outside, but there were lights and voices nearby. The coachman was standing at the door. "All out," he called. "Come, mademoiselle, we have a short stop here at Lisieux. If you want breakfast, hurry inside." Breakfast? Can it be morning already? She thought. She felt for her purse and followed the other passengers to the inn. The coach was standing in a cobbled yard, and several men were busy in the half-light, unloading boxes from the roof of the coach. Horses were snorting and trampling, and their steamy breath caught the light from the windows of the inn. Before she stepped into the light and warmth of the inn doorway, Euphrasie noticed the coachman with a pie in one hand and a steaming mug in the other. He was watching the grooms as they led away the tired horses and began to back a new team into their places in front of the coach. She had scarcely started her hot drink when a stout aproned man rang the bell hanging just outside the inn door. Leaning in through the doorway, he bawled above the noise of the breakfast room, "Coach for Évreux, leaving in 5 minutes. Coach for Évreux, leaving. All aboard." Euphrasie hurried back to the coach. As she neared the steps, she looked up to the coach roof. Her box had disappeared under a load of new luggage. She began to look desperately for it. "No, I must not be afraid," she thought. "It is well labelled. I must trust the coachman who is taking care of it." She settled back into her seat as the coach moved off. She thought again about trust. Trusting the coachman with her luggage. Trusting God who was calling her. "This should be the happiest day of my life," she thought. It did not feel very happy. "This must be what Father Le Fournier calls walking by faith," she thought. "When Natalie died, we told God we accepted His holy will, but we were still sad for a long time. Soon I will be joining the Sisters of Calvary, and then I will be truly happy. That really will be the happiest day of my life. That is what God has made me for." All that long day the coach rumbled on through lonely country roads, through villages and through busy towns. By evening they were coming into the large town of Évreux. Euphrasie watched everything intently, moved more by anxiety than by curiosity. Time and again she had pulled out the small piece of paper on which Father Le Fournier had written his instructions. She had read and reread until she knew them by heart. Tonight she was to stay at the hostelry. In the morning she was to proceed to the railway station and board a train for Paris. "It will be very new and strange for you," Father Le Fournier had explained, "but it will not be difficult. That part of France is very different from Normandy. Industry is highly developed. There is a large and busy population, and the most amazing machines have been invented to speed up the work. Travel must be fast and modern too, and many people travel by the new railways. Do not be afraid. In the morning, take a cab to the railway station. You have only to follow the other travellers and do what they are doing. The railway company even employs attendants to help its customers." The next morning, when the cab let her down, Euphrasie followed the stream of people flowing under an ornate iron archway. She could see from the inscription above that this was the entrance to the railway station. The place inside was unlike anything she could have imagined, but seeing it for herself now, She realized that Father Le Fournier had described it well. A porter in cap and black apron took her box and led her to the middle of the concourse, a long platform where many people were already gathered. There was a great noise of walking and talking, and rumbling of handcarts and trundlers. Euphrasie noticed a ripple of movement as the whole crowd turned to gaze expectantly beyond her. She turned too, and saw a great long wide ditch beyond the edge of the platform. Along the flat bottom of the ditch ran a double line of metal rails. There was a loud shriek and a kind of piercing moan, and then a rumble which shook the ground. An enormous machine, a monster of shining brass and green paint and clouds of steam, appeared rolling along the metal rails. Euphrasie had never seen such a thing before, but she recognized it at once. Someone, maybe Uncle Francis in his reading lessons, or Papa, had once explained the principles of the steam engine to her. With great groans and belching steam from its tall chimney, the train slid to a halt, towering above the waiting crowd. Railway attendants began to open doors and carry luggage to and from the train. They assisted travellers, men, women, and even well-dressed little children, up and down the steps to the platform. Euphrasie's neighbours surged forward. She seized her box and followed them up the very high, narrow steps into the great vehicle. She remembered Father Le Fournier's advice. Avoid the best and the poorest coaches in the train. Those with velvet-covered seats are too expensive. Those with benches of rough wood are for the coarsest men, not fit company for a respectable young woman travelling alone. The people seated nearest to her looked respectable, and the seats were plain but neatly finished, so Euphrasie settled down there. She found the journey to Paris extremely interesting. It would take some hours, she knew, but she was not sorry for that, because there was so much to see. If only they could be here, she thought. Papa and little Louis and all of them, how astonished they would be. She noted surprising things to tell them in her next letter. The train was incredibly fast, faster than any horse could gallop, she was sure, and it was amazingly comfortable. Its motion was so smooth and regular that even as it sped along, a railway official was able to walk to and fro, collecting fares and issuing a small card as receipt to each passenger. Euphrasie thought often of her family, how she wished that they could have shared this adventure with her. How interested Papa would have been to see the great machine of black iron and rich green paint and shining brass, and how excited young Louis, and how agreeably surprised all of them by the speed and comfort of the journey. Euphrasie fumbled in her bag to consult her notes once more, checking again where she was to stay overnight with trustworthy friends of Father Le Fournier. Post office, she read from the list. Yes, I must find that post office Father Le Fournier mentions, and I must send a message to Mamma and Papa as soon as possible. Euphrasie knew that Paris was said to be the most beautiful city in the world, but she had no time for sightseeing that evening. Taking out her pen and her carefully wrapped bottle of ink, she wrote long and lovingly to her family, trying to describe the wonders of her new world as vividly as she had seen them. The next morning, after she had posted her letter, she boarded a train for Champagne in the southeast of France. This was a long, long trip. The countryside became more and more different from the fertile farmlands of Normandy and from the populous cities of the north. The train chugged on, hour after hour, day and night and day again, stopping briefly to take on water and coal. Passengers came and went. Some noticed the pretty face and bright eyes of the graceful girl gazing out of the window hour after hour. Sometimes a well-groomed young man would pause in the aisle, ready to bow, to charm and be charmed. But she was quite unaware of anyone's presence. Occasionally she would glance up sharply at some passing change or disturbance, and then her eyes would drop again. Euphrasie was far away. Outside there were great stretches of wastelands and pine forests with small shabby villages scattered among the hills and rocks. The country grew wilder and rougher and more mountainous. At a small town called Chaumont, Euphrasie had to leave the train. Her destination now was Couves, a small village some miles away. There was no regular coach service to such an insignificant place, but Euphrasie was able to get a seat in a country cart, which made the trip for rural deliveries. Seated in front of crates and kegs, she sat shyly beside the taciturn driver. There was nothing to do except watch the fields and hedges roll slowly by. This last stretch of the journey seemed endless. After hours of plodding along between the ragged hedgerows of a narrow, empty road, the cart at last crested a hill, and in the hollow before them Euphrasie saw a tiny stone church standing between two huge lime trees. "Couves," said the driver gruffly, waving his hand vaguely at it. "The Hermitage," he added impatiently. Euphrasie realized then that the village she had been watching for lay almost hidden among the trees in this hollow surrounded by steep hills. The cart drew up in a yard behind the ancient chapel. There were more buildings beyond the boundary wall. "That's it, the Hermitage," said the driver. "That's where the nuns are, the Sisters of Calvary." Euphrasie fumbled in her purse while he unloaded her box. She soon discovered that right now Father Chantom, the founder of the congregation, was away working at his other project, the Divine Word Fathers. He had left young Reverend Mother Marie Barbier Guillot, the first of his new missionary sisters, in charge of the community. The congregation was only 8 years founded, and already it was flourishing. The old hermitage was now too small. The boarding school had just been shifted into a new and larger building, and the sisters were still in need of more room for their convent. Reverend Mother Marie Barbier was delighted to hear that the new postulant had arrived, and she hurried downstairs to greet Euphrasie. Euphrasie immediately liked the first two sisters she met. Even while they were greeting her, she was thinking, "These are my sisters, but what happens now? How do I join them? What must I do?" She was eager, impatient even, and more than a little apprehensive now that her goal was so close. She had always liked to be sure, to be right in what she did. The sisters brought her a hot drink and something to eat, and then withdrew, to make arrangements, they said. Euphrasie ate quickly and nervously. Even with the drink, she found the biscuits hard to swallow. The time has come at last, she thought. In a few minutes, maybe, they'll put a veil on my head, and I will be one of them. But what must I do? How could I ever be good enough to be like them? Must I make a retreat or something first, or many retreats? How can I do it? Oh, Jesus, help me. Let it be soon. But I don't know what to do. Mother Mary Barbier came through the door again with an older sister, a small, rather stooped woman with a face badly scarred from smallpox. She looked kind and honest. Euphrasie stood up smiling. Her heart was beating fast. Now it will happen, she thought. They will tell me what to do. And this is our novice mistress, Mother St. John, Mother Mary Barbier was saying. Then for the third time she asked, And how old are you, my child? 19, Reverend Mother, Euphrasie replied, a little puzzled. Do you mean 19 already, or 19 on your next birthday? 19 already, Reverend Mother. I shall be 20 on 4th of January next year. You seem very young, said the older sister. Mother Mary Barbier seemed a little hesitant. My dear, she said, we are very pleased to have you here, and we are very pleased also with the recommendation given by your spiritual director, Father Lafournier. But we think perhaps it might be better if you waited a little longer. Euphrasie stared at her, speechless. She could not believe what she was hearing. We don't mean that you should go home again, Mother Mary Barbier added hastily, but we do think that you would benefit by further education. You are also very, very young in appearance. We thought you might like to spend a year in our boarding school before finally deciding your vocation. Oh, Reverend Mother, I have prayed and thought about my vocation for years. I know what God wants me. My dear, who knows what God wants? Mother Mary Barbier paused for a moment. Our boarding school offers an excellent education. Your accent would be greatly improved. Euphrasie flushed. For the first time in her life, she felt the utter inadequacy of her education. She blushed for her broad country accent, the speech of a farmer or a peasant. She had never felt ashamed of it before. She had hardly been aware of it. She blushed for her presumption. This sister, standing tall and graceful and gracious before her, had not left school at 13. Her pronunciation was that of a cultured and accomplished lady. Mother Mary Barbier was watching Euphrasie intently. There was only sweetness and honesty in her gaze. God deserves the very best we can give him, she murmured. Euphrasie's heart sank. She had come to give him all that heart. Was he rejecting her right now, or turning her aside again to endless searchings? Mother Mary Barbier saw that Euphrasie was crushed. She tried to be gentle, to give her time. It would have been much easier to say, "Don't be distressed, come right in as you wish." This little girl seemed to have some good points, but Mary Barbier did not know her in any depth. Was she immature only in physical appearance, or was she a romantic adolescent, a pious sentimentalist? After 1 year's education, you would still be very young, Mother St. John remarked. Thoughts were racing round in panic inside Euphrasie's head. Is he testing me? What does he want me to do? What shall I do? No answer came in the silence. Aloud, Euphrasie said, "How do I know what is God's will for me now?" Mother Mary Barbier smiled gently. "If your director asked you that, what would you say?" "I would say, he tells me through the church and those who have authority over me." There was silence again. "What is he asking you now, then?" asked Mary Barbier. Euphrasie did not want to answer, but she remembered what Father Le Fournier used to say, "To live for God and not for your own satisfaction." She was silent for a moment. "Very well, Reverend Mother," she said. "I will go to the boarding school for a year." The words nearly choked her. The lump was back in her throat again, as if she were back in Con, right now, saying goodbye to the cluster of Barbiers at the roadside. That evening, the trousseau which Euphrasie had gathered for her convent life was packed away neatly in the hermitage. Euphrasie and the rest of her luggage were escorted to the boarding school. The next morning, Euphrasie started school again. It was so different from her earlier, happier school days. Tiny though she was, smaller than any of the senior girls, she was no longer a child among children. The others sensed it and were shy of the new girl, though she was always pleasant with them. She could no longer play and chatter like a schoolgirl. Instead, she flung herself into her studies. Mother Mary Barbier soon realised that Euphrasie was far beyond her other pupils in maturity of judgment. Her academic work was surprisingly good, thanks to Euphrasie's natural intelligence and to Uncle Francis's informal evening classes. Her accent improved markedly. She was particularly clever with her hands and was keen to learn new crafts and skills. Mother Mary Barbier and the novice mistress began to renew their earlier decision. They talked about Euphrasie's acceptance of their recommendation, in spite of her bitter disappointment. "That in itself is a sign of her spiritual depth," said Mother St. John. "It takes most of us a long time to learn to accept God's will when He contradicts our dearest wishes." One day, Mother Mary Barbier called Euphrasie aside as the class was dismissed. "The novices are moving into a new wing of the convent this evening," she said, smiling. "Do you still wish to join them?"